On this episode of Andy's Autosport TV, we're going to install our hotchkis lowering springs on our Project Firebird. Not only will adding lowering springs improve the look of your car, but it's going to dramatically improve handling by lowering that center of gravity. Lowering your center of gravity is beneficial because what happens is, the higher you have all that weight off the ground, when you turn a corner it tries to roll. So the lower you can get that center of gravity, the more you keep that body from rolling. When you're on our website and you're looking for drop springs, you'll notice that we list how much the springs will drop. Sometimes the front will be different from the rear. This is up to the manufacturer's discretion on what they think is optimal. If you're looking for an adjustable kit, you definitely need to look in our coilover section. Now, when it comes to lowering springs, like all other components, you get what you pay for. There's a lot of engineering that goes into properly designing a spring. Now, today we're going to be installing our hotchkis springs on our Project Firebird. Now, these are a progressive spring. A progressive spring, as you can see, has two different styles of coil. One of them is kind of big at the top, and as you can see, it gets stiffer at the bottom. Now, the advantage of a progressive spring, when you're driving down the highway, you've got the coils that are real wide apart. Those are real soft, so that you're still going to maintain that factory ride. Then when you get into the corners, you're going to compress down through those as you're cornering hard one way or the other, get into those short coils, which is really going to help your car handle. Now, even if the springs that you're looking at on the website are not a progressive spring, they're still going to be significantly better than a cut set of factory springs. Now, when you cut your factory springs, it changes everything. It actually makes them stiffer, not softer. You have shock problems and all kinds of issues. So one of the questions that we get on the website is, how do I avoid a rough ride when I put lowering springs on, or I don't want that rough ride? Not a problem. Most of the people that have that rough ride probably have been in a vehicle that had cut springs. If you buy a good set of engineered springs from andysautosport.com, you're definitely going to get the handling and the feel that you're looking for out of that lowered car. Now, some manufacturers actually give us the spring rates in their kits, and when we have that, we actually pass that on to you. Now, this is just strictly for information purposes only, not really necessary for the average user. If you're a serious track junkie, this can help you tune for when you go to the track by changing spring rates. Other than that, the spring rates that come with the kit were specifically engineered for your application. Now, when you're lowering your vehicle with lowering springs, there's a couple of things to consider, especially if it's going to be over 1.5 inches. One of those things is camber. Now, camber is when your wheels are cocked out like this. Now, there's a way to correct that with a camber kit. Now, what it is it's usually an eccentric or a bolt, and what that does is it gives you a much greater range of motion to where you can straighten that wheel back out. Now, when you get into camber, what happens is the wheels are cocked in like this, as we've already said. What causes that is, as you lower the car, as you put lower springs in there, the control arms come up and get everything kind of out of whack of the factory geometry. The reason you put a camber bolt in there is it allows you to rotate and get those control arms back up level and get those wheels sitting straight again. Next thing you need to look at is shocks. If you're lowering your vehicle more than 1.5 inches, you have to remember that you're going to take 1.5 inches of that compression away from that shock. So you have a better chance of bottoming out. So a good set of lowering shocks should definitely be in your shopping cart as well. Neither of these is absolutely necessary, but your ride quality might suffer a little bit, or you may wear out some suspension components or tires a little earlier than expected. If you're going to lower your vehicle more than 1.5 inches, you definitely need to look into a set of lowering shocks and a camber kit. Now, today we're going to be installing our hotchkis springs on our Project Firebird. We're only going to be lowering it 1 inch, so we're not going to install a camber kit, and we're also not going to change the shocks. Now, we chose Hotchkis for our Project Firebird because they are a top shelf company. All their components are track tested on their 200-foot skid pad, a 600-foot autocross course, and a 14-turn road course. Now, we're going to get on to our install, and we're going to replace our factory springs with these progressive ones from Hotchkis. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to remove this entire assembly right here, the strut assembly. How I've started it, I've already taken out my sway bar link. That way our sway bar is not holding our control arm up out of place. I'm going to remove the nuts and bolts from the bottom of the strut assembly itself which is bolted to the control arm. Then we're going to drop the entire top half of the assembly down. Okay, now we're going to remove our mounts from the top of our strut assembly. Now we have a strut tower brace on this from Hotchkis, so we're going to have to remove that just by taking these 2 bolts off. And then there are 4 bolts that we have to take off in order to drop our strut assembly out. Now in our case, this is very atypical, but in our case we're going to have to remove our master cylinder. Not a big deal, it's just a couple of bolts, and then we'll have our strut on the ground. Okay guys, now here's what we've done. I've got the assembly in my hand. This is basically the assembly. You see the coil spring here over top of our strut. Now this entire assembly just slid out. Now on some vehicles, and this is very, very important, on some vehicles this top nut right here will be exposed from the top of the car. You never, ever, ever loosen this unless you have a spring clamp or a spring tool on your strut spring. If you don't do that, as soon as this bolt comes all the way off, this thing is going to come out at tremendous force, can break your leg or cause some serious injury. So make sure that you don't ever loosen up this center bolt. There's usually 2 or 3 or 4 bolts that will hold the entire assembly in your car. These are the only ones you want to take off. The center bolt that goes directly to the strut, you never want to loosen until you have spring compressor on your spring. Okay, now we're getting ready to use our spring compressor on our strut springs. Now there's a couple different types. This right here is a McPherson strut type. This I really like because it actually has the locks. Once you set this over the top of the spring, it actually has locks to make sure that the spring stays in the cradle. Now this one is a little tough to get in there, but what happens is once you get it over the top, and now we'll have to tighten this up a little bit, then this locks down there, and it actually keeps the spring in the spring compressor. Then you have another type like this, which just grabs it from both sides. Now this one you can see is a lot thinner, so this is going to make it a little easier to get into those tight reach springs, which we're probably going to have to use when we start with our Hotchkis springs. Okay, now as you can see, we've got our spring clamps on, spring compressor on our coil spring. What we're doing here is we're tightening them down one side at a time, or back and forth, okay? You tighten a little bit on one side, then you tighten on the other one. That way the spring doesn't collapse out to one side or the other. You should also always use a hand wrench. Now you'll see a lot of people that'll actually use impact wrenches on these. Really don't like doing that. So even though it's a little bit of a pain, it's a little bit safer if you're using a hand wrench, because an impact wrench is designed to hammer and hammer and hammer. And what that can do is, if any of these are on there a little tentatively, it can actually spring out of place. So you want to make sure you use a hand wrench. It takes a little bit longer, but definitely worth it for the safety factor. Okay, now we have our spring completely compressed, and you can tell because it's loose inside of here, so there's no tension up against the top. Now we're going to take our nut off the top of our strut. Now, as you can see, this one is really rusted on, probably going to be a real pain in the neck to get off. I can tell you right now from experience, this is the stuff you need. Get some PP Blaster, go down to your local parts store, and spray it on top of this and let it penetrate in there a little bit. Otherwise, it's probably going to be an all-day job trying to get this nut off. So we're going to do that. We're going to let it soak for just a minute, and then we're going to hit it with our impact wrench and hopefully knock that thing off, and then install our new spring and strut into our Project Firebird. Okay, now we've got our spring compressor on our new Hotchkis spring. One of the things that you need to do is there's a dust cover that goes on the strut. Now it's best to put this in before you start to do the spring compressing, because usually they have a solid top and they're really hard to get to. So just make sure you put that in there. Now we've got our spring compressed a little bit. We're going to test fit it on our new strut to make sure that it all fits and see if we have our spring compressed enough. And if we don't, of course, we'll have to compress a little more, but this will give us a good idea. I don't ever like to compress them any more than what they have to be. The more dynamic tension you put on the spring, the more chance there is for the spring compressor to come loose or break. So I only like to compress it as much as I need to. So we're going to kind of test fit it and kind of see where we are right now. Okay, we still need to compress this a little bit more. So I'm going to put this down, and I'm going to run each bolt up one at a time, just a little bit, and go back and forth until I get it compressed where I need it. So now we've got our spring compressed enough where we can get our parts back on top here. we have this bushing. It's going to go back in here, and then we'll put our nut on there. Now, one thing I want to say about when you're doing your springs, they have pockets that are actually built for the end of the spring. So if you notice right here, this little pad that's down here, this rubber pad, has a notch in it. That's where the end of the spring is supposed to be. Exact same thing for the top. So make sure you line those up. That way your spring won't pop and settle later, and everything will be exactly where it's supposed to be. Now, to decompress the spring, we do exactly the same way we compressed it. We loosen a little bit on each side, alternating back and forth. This is going to keep that spring in the fixture. Okay, in order to make this a little bit easier to reinstall, I'm going to go ahead and knock the upper ball joint loose, or the upper control arm. I'm going to take this off, and I'm going to reaffix it to my assembly, then put it up inside. That's going to make it a whole lot easier to do the installation without having to manipulate everything around. It's pretty simple. Just take our castle nut loose. There's a cotter pin in here, which I already removed. And take our pickle fork, it's called. We're going to pop it underneath our seal as to not break the seal. I'm going to put our castle nut on and leave it on there just a little bit so it doesn't pop out. I normally do that and forgot that, so we're going to leave that on just a little bit. Get our pickle fork in there. Once you get it in there nice and tight, you can wrap on top of the ball joint, and that'll help loosen it up. As you see, the very next shot knocked it off of there. And this will make the next part of this very simple. So now what we'll do is we're going to take this and mount it on top of our strut assembly. And that'll make life a lot easier when it's time to install this back up on top. There's also this little rubber grommet that goes on here. This kind of keeps it from squeaking up underneath the car. I'm going to take that up under there like that. Oop. Now we have our strut assembly back in place. We can go ahead and tighten our bolts up on the top, then we'll get everything in order on the bottom and push that back up into place. Okay, now we're going to reconnect our spindle to our upper control arm. Now you can use blocks of wood or a bottle jack. That'll certainly make this job much easier. Now I've got my castle nut back in place. Now this is the old cotter pin that we took out. They're real cheap. I buy a whole set of them. You can buy a whole box of them. And you can pick these up at andysautosport.com and just keep these around with you. That way every time you take one out, just replace it. They're just little pieces of aluminum, and every time you bend them, they fatigue. So there's no reason not to put a brand new one in every time you take one out. Okay, now we're going to reconnect the strut assembly to the lower control arm. Okay, now the rear on our particular application here is much easier. Just needs a pry bar. Now on some vehicles you'll need to probably take either the shocks loose or the sway bar loose, but on this one it's real simple. All you do is release the tension from the suspension by raising it up on the body. Don't raise it up on the suspension, raise it up on the body. And then our rear coil spring here, you can see, is really loose. So we're just going to use a pry bar and pop it right over the top. It's going to come right out of place. Yep. Okay, when you take the spring out, sometimes this spring rubber will actually stick up in the pocket that's up here. Now, if you notice on the spring rubber, it also has a spot where it's indexed so that the new coil spring has a pocket for where the end is. You want to put it in there like that. Now sometimes these are kind of a pain to keep in place. What you can do is you can actually just take some black tape, some electrical tape or masking tape, and tape this onto the top of the spring. Makes it a lot easier to hold in place. We're going to try to do it without it first. There you have it. It popped right into place. About 5 minutes worth of work. And this baby's ready to put the wheel back on and try out our new suspension. As you can see, our hotchkis springs are performing exactly the way they were supposed to. We hope you've learned something today, and we'll see you on another episode of Andy's Autosport TV.